All interrogations included a common set of questions, and if someone slipped and said something different from one time to the next, the Russians became suspicious and accused him of lying. Then they would really bear down on him to find out what he was hiding. They caught many people that way, and it was horrible for those who got caught. Those who were trying to hide something, those who said something dumb, those whose unit caught the Russians' attention, or those who they thought might become an agent for them, were interrogated more frequently than the rest of us. The interrogators were all NKVD agents, and all except Colonel Stem wore Russian army uniforms, but with different coloured hats. Once, when I was being interrogated by another interrogator, the interpreter was a pretty young woman lieutenant. At one point, the interrogator left me alone with her. I had just said I had been in Italy, and while the interrogator was gone, she told me that she had been in Italy also. We talked about Italy, and she asked if I knew the Italian song Parla mi d'amore, Speak to me of love, and she sang a few words of it. We talked very cordially for several minutes, but when the interrogator returned, she became sober and businesslike again. It was obvious that she had been in Italy as a spy, because normal Russian officers did not go to Italy before or during the war. That was one of the very few instances when I saw ordinary human behaviour from a Russian, although Colonel Stern was capable of showing a little human behaviour in a one-on-one situation. I quickly learned enough Russian to understand my interrogators' questions, although I never let them know that, because pretending ignorance gave me time to prepare my answer while the interpreter translated the question. This was important because sometimes just a single word about cutting trees for bunkers or even firewood in Russia, or feeding Russian grain to your horses, or having blown up a bridge during a retreat in Russia, could later mean a sentence of up to 25 years in a labour camp. That was a little game they invented later, when they wanted an excuse for not sending certain people home. Fortunately, my story was believable and always consistent. I convinced my interrogators that I never had problems with supplies during the invasion of Russia, because we were always on the post road and our supply columns were able to keep up. My story was logical, and I never slipped up, so they believed it. I was lucky that I was always along a major supply route during the invasion of Russia, that I was in the hospital and at school a lot, and that I was never in the wrong place at the wrong time, where a village had been destroyed, for example. I was always extremely careful about what I said during interrogations. I made it a policy never to admit that people in my artillery battery had ever killed a chicken in Russia or used Russian firewood or hay, but I was always careful never to lie to them about anything other than that. They would ask you the same question again next year, but from a different angle, and they would catch you if you tried to lie. I never said a word more than was absolutely necessary, but no less than would provide a reasonable answer. I tried never to be openly hostile toward the Soviet Union, but when asked, I always insisted that Germany had to have good relations with all countries in order to get along in the post-war world, even though Russia was obviously her most powerful neighbour. If pressed, I told them frankly that I did not believe that communism was the best form of government for Germany, but I was careful not to criticise their system or praise fascism. After an interrogation, we had to sign a transcript of it, and anything in it could be used against us. Once, however, an interrogator ordered me to sign a transcript that was written in Russian, and I refused to sign it because I could not read it. The interrogator became angry and started shouting, so I wrote, "I do not understand the Russian language," and signed that. Then he got even more angry, but I refused to sign it any other way, because if I had, it could have been my death warrant. Another objective of their interrogations was to get information on people in order to determine whether they might be candidates to become spies for them. We had a continuous coming and going of prisoners from Krasnogorsk to and from Lubyanka prison and Butyrka prison in Moscow. I was lucky that I was never taken to either of the political prisons and could spend all my years of captivity in prison camps, where the area we had to move about in was about 300 by 150 metres, instead of a 4 by 5 metre prison cell that sometimes housed up to 6 people. In the camp, we were under the constant surveillance of the activists and the Russian guards, but we could at least move about and go outside the barracks. Especially important inmates were kept separated and isolated at Lubyanka and Butyrka, so the Russians could maintain complete control over them. When the Russians thought they had all the information from someone in Lubyanka or Butyrka, they moved him from his prison cell to Krasnogorsk. They still interrogated everyone at regular intervals, however, and when they discovered something about someone that they had missed the first time, they took him back to Lubyanka or Butyrka. Every week newcomers arrived from the political prison cells, always with pasty white faces, because they never saw the light of day in their prison cells. For a period of time after arriving at the camp, they would be afraid of everything and everyone. They would be very quiet and extremely suspicious. These people were easy prey for the activists and the spies. They usually either succumbed to the attempts of the activists to make them collaborators, or went the opposite route and took a foolish stance of open resistance, in which case they eventually disappeared. Von Dufing, Refior and Weidling were all in Butyrka, as were many German generals and general staff officers. When the Russians finished with most of them, they sent them to our prison camp if they did not consider them dangerous. Otherwise, they sent them to the labour camps. Refior was released to our camp, and von Dufing was sent to a labour camp. In the labour camp von Dufing was eventually sent to, the Russians apparently intended the prisoners to die, considering their exposure to the weather, the hours of hard work, the quarters, and the inadequate food. It was also near the Arctic, where it was dark several months of the year and extremely depressing. Von Dufing survived 2 years there. The first Christmas in captivity, in 1945, everyone in my group saved a small portion of his bread, sugar and fat each day for 2 weeks to make a cake. Because the bread was 2/3 water, we could mash it up with a little sugar to make the cake. Then we mixed sugar with butter, margarine, or lard, whatever form of fat we were receiving at that time, to make a sort of icing for the cake. Someone else in our group made the cake, and I made the icing and decoration. On Christmas Eve, we all got together as a group to celebrate. Meanwhile, we had to guard the cake carefully to prevent it from being stolen, because everybody was so hungry. The taste of the cake was pure heaven for us after the prison food. We sat together in our bunk compartment and reminisced about past Christmases at home and about our wives and children. We sang a few Christmas songs, and the chaplain in our group conducted a little service. It had to be done very quietly, because the Russians would not tolerate religious services. We exchanged gifts that we had made or bought for one another, things like cigarette cases, in an attempt to maintain a semblance of civilized life in prison. Those who had the skills to do so made things, and those who did not have the skills bought things with cigarettes or food. After the singing and celebration, Christmas Eve was a very quiet and sad time in the camp, because we were all lost in remembrances of a much happier past. Christmas was the worst day of the year, in terms of longing for home. During the Nuremberg trials, the Russians wanted to blame the massacre of Polish soldiers at Katyn on Germany, even though the International Red Cross had already filed a report that the Russians had clearly committed the crime. To prove their case, they needed a foolproof witness, so they cast about for a German enlisted man they could coerce into testifying that he had been part of the execution squad. They found their candidate in a labour camp and brought him to Krasnogorsk for coaching. He was a big farm boy, fun-loving and much too trusting. He was not intelligent enough to realize that his actions endangered his life. He was from near Nuremberg, so they promised him he could visit his family if he would cooperate with them. It was easy for him to rationalize what he did, especially when the Russians pointed out that the country he had sworn allegiance to no longer existed. They gave him better food and a new uniform and made him feel important. They coached him for weeks, probably until he honestly believed what he was saying. None of this was common knowledge to us at the time. Although he talked to some of his friends about it, the rest of us learned about it only after the fact. Then one day he was gone, and a few days later, when we were read the news, we learned that he had been presented as a prime witness for the Russians at the Nuremberg trials. He described in great detail how his infantry unit had carried out the Katyn massacre. The Western countries ignored the testimony, however, because of the Red Cross records, so the elaborate lie the Russians had constructed around him did them no good. After being inundated for days with news of the Katyn massacre and how the German army had cold-bloodedly mowed down more than 4,000 innocent Polish officers, we suddenly heard no more about Katyn. A few days later, their star witness returned to the camp. He was still almost as cocky as he had been before, but not quite, because he had not been permitted to see his parents as they had promised. Perhaps if they had succeeded with their big lie, they would have at least let his parents visit him. As it was, he got nothing for his treachery except better treatment in the camp. He was probably put in a jail cell in Nuremberg and kept there except when he was testifying. They had also told him that if he did a good job, they might release him after he had testified. He should have known they could not release him after he had lied for them. When they returned him to the camp, he still got more and better food, and he still had his new uniform. But in the following days and weeks he began to complain to others that the Russians had not delivered on their promises. When his complaining was reported to the Russians, they stopped the better treatment. He ate what we ate, and they took back his new uniform. Then he complained even louder, which was unbelievably stupid. So he disappeared. They love what a traitor can do for them, but they despise him as a person. During the Nuremberg trials, we got daily reports about what was happening. We learned the details of the Nazi extermination camps and finally began to accept them as true rather than just Russian propaganda. There had been unanimous skepticism among us about the extermination camp stories because of the attempts of the Russians to blame their own slaughter of Polish officers at Katyn on us. After that, we just assumed that these stories of horrible atrocities in the German concentration camps were just so much Russian propaganda. But when it became clear that the Western Allies, as well as Russia, were prosecuting the Germans responsible for the atrocities, it was evident that there might be some truth to the stories, although we still found it impossible to believe that 6 million Jews could possibly have been put to death. We knew that the Jews had been persecuted by the Nazi government, however, and that they had been rounded up and sent to concentration camps just because they were Jews. Anti-Semitism had a long history in Germany, and Hitler used it to his political advantage by blaming everything negative on the Jews. So it was not difficult for us to believe that some of the Jews might have been killed, but the figure of 6 million stretched credulity too far for us. Nevertheless, we slowly, sadly, began to realize that the Nazis had indeed committed terrible crimes against humanity. I had known about political concentration camps like Dachau, where people were sent for what was known as political re-education. But those people returned and resumed their roles in German society, and when they returned, they did not oppose the system any longer. This was common knowledge. Germany had no tradition of the freedom of speech that Americans cherish so much, and we did not see anything unusual about people being sent to Dachau for re-education, especially since it was helping to maintain stability. There were jokes about Dachau then, just as there are jokes about being sent to Siberia today. Union leaders and communists who fought against the Nazi program were sent there, as well as Jews and homosexuals. But nobody was killed there, at least that we knew of. In contemplating these things, I often went back to my teenage years in the middle 30s, when Hitler had been immensely popular with the German people, when no one in Germany could have even dreamed of the nightmares to come. Hitler had brought political and economic stability to Germany, which appealed greatly to the average German. In effect, he had reunited a German people who had been divided by literally dozens of political parties during the democratic Weimar Republic, established in Germany following World War I. A major factor in Hitler's popularity was the restoration of national pride. All during the 20s and early 30s, we were constantly being told by the rest of the world that we had started World War I, which we felt was not true. And this was what we got for it. And we were constantly being told by the German government and press that the Versailles Treaty took away big pieces of German territory and gave them to other countries. so Hitler's moves that were restoring some national pride were generally appreciated by the German people. Hitler disavowed the Versailles Treaty, which had hurt Germany so badly economically, and his moves to recover land and German population that had been taken away from Germany were popular with the people. The treaty had also limited Germany to a 100,000-man army, making it impossible for us to defend ourselves. So Hitler's expansion of the military forces after tearing up the Versailles Treaty was also widely popular. Hitler dominated Germany because he was effective in his early years and because he offered Germans their national pride back. Never in our wildest dreams could we have anticipated the atrocities his government was to commit. Losing the war, losing my freedom, and losing my country were things I could think through and understand. War is a calculated risk, with a winner and a loser. I could understand the penalties we had to pay for losing, but we had thought of our participation in the war as noble and honourable. Now we could only be ashamed that our noble venture to right the injustices of the Versailles Treaty and regain what we thought of as rightfully ours had led to the inhuman horrors of extermination camps. There was no way to rationalize attempting to exterminate a whole race of people. I remembered the government propaganda that there was a worldwide Jewish conspiracy to take over the positions of power in all the countries of the world. In the 1920s and 1930s, Jews held high government positions, and they were the bankers and the industrialists. They controlled much of Germany's wealth, and the propaganda ministry harped on that constantly when the Nazis took over. But even if the government had indeed felt threatened by such a Jewish conspiracy, it was madness to think that an entire race of people should be exterminated. I was sickened by this news. I finally decided that my inability to come to terms with it was going to chip away at my mental and emotional strength, which was already being tested severely, so I filed the issue away in a dark corner of my mind and did not participate in the discussions taking place on the subject. I had to accept the fact that it had happened so I could get on with the business of living, but I did not have to like it or discuss it. I simply forced myself to concentrate on the here and now so that I could survive each day as it came. As a professional soldier, I could not escape my share of the guilt, because without us, Hitler could not have done the horrible things he had done. But as a human being, I felt no guilt, because I had had no part in or knowledge of the things he had done. Having to accept that my government had, in fact, murdered huge numbers of Jews threw me into a deep depression. I still found it difficult to believe that Hitler was personally responsible for such actions, but they could not have been done without his acceptance of them. In all of my experience, only old Herr Hofer had been able to see that Hitler would lead us to ruin. "At what cost?" he had asked. I knew now that even Herr Hofer could not possibly have foreseen the horrible cost that Hitler would extract, not just from the German people, but from the world. And it was our blind and unquestioning faith in him that had enabled him to do so. The population of the camp fell politically into three groups: the indifferent majority, the opposition, and the activists. Most of the prisoners belonged to the indifferent majority. Under pressure from the activists, they would usually do what the activists wanted, but for the most part they avoided conflict and took the path of least resistance. I was part of the opposition, but we had to remain largely silent. Overt opposition could lead to our extermination for fascist activities or war crimes, but we refused to participate in anything political and refused to give reasons, and we got away with it. As long as we kept quiet, we were not tortured or singled out for abuse, except for being hassled by the German activists. The activists, who were also called anti-fascists, were open collaborators. They ran the camp and controlled the jobs. They took their orders from the Russians, reported to the Russians, and spied for the Russians. The Russians called the activists Nachalnik, meaning chief or superior, and we called them that sometimes. If we wanted anything from the Russians, such as alleviation of the bedbug problem, we had to ask the activists instead of the Russians, because only the activists could talk to the Russians. To maintain their standing as activists and therefore retain their privileges of more and better food and all-around better treatment, they were required to acknowledge, accept and espouse the Russian point of view on everything. Some activists were not as radical as others and tried to maintain a relatively good relationship with members of the opposition by discussing things objectively. Mostly these were people whose families lived in the Russian occupation zone of Germany and who felt they had no choice but to go along to some degree, but they wanted to avoid the label traitor, which the opposition gave to activists. A smaller group of the activists were real agitators for the Russians. They did the political work, were barrack commanders, propagandists, etc. They praised and made excuses for everything that came from the Russian authorities. Only in very rare cases were these people actually converted communists. They behaved as they did either just to get better treatment or because they felt guilty about something, such as being an actual war criminal. These people were dangerous because of their fanaticism. Whenever there was something unpleasant to be done, the Russians did not do it themselves. They had their collaborators, the activists, do it. For example, if there was an escape attempt, they would call in the activists and tell them, "This has happened, so now you all have to stand out in the cold for an hour." The activists would then do their bidding, and we all would have to stand out in the cold for an hour. They had all the power, and the rest of us were at their mercy. Activists held pro-communist lectures we were all required to attend. They performed as actors in political plays we were required to attend, and they wrote inflammatory articles we were required to read. The activists also circulated political resolutions on subjects over which the Russians were at odds with the West. A resolution would be a 1- or 2-page statement of support for the Russian position on the issue. The activists would pressure everyone to sign these documents. They would say, "It is for peace. The Soviet Union wants peace for the whole world, and the Western powers are warmongers. Are you for peace or for war? If you are for peace, you will sign this resolution. If you do not sign it, you are for war." At the time of the Berlin blockade, for example, when the Russians tried to close the access routes to Berlin to the Western Allies, we were pressured to sign a resolution supporting the Soviet blockade of Berlin. The purpose of the resolutions was obviously to control our minds, since the resolutions were of no practical value to the Russians after they had been signed. Probably 80% of the prisoners signed these resolutions for fear of the consequences if they did not. The activists were not all low-ranking or unintelligent people. Some of them were generals and PhDs. In fact, they were often the worst of the lot. A Dr. Naroki, for example, was one of the more active and dangerous of them. He harangued prisoners to sign resolutions and worked constantly to agitate other prisoners and convert them to collaborators for the Russians. A former university professor, he was in the camp because the Russians perceived him as an intellectual and therefore potentially dangerous, and he was determined to convince them that they had nothing to fear from him. He outperformed the Russians in his propaganda attempts. He was completely self-serving and disdainful of everyone else. Supercilious and arrogant, he seemed to have learned nothing from Germany's defeat. He looked forward to a high-ranking job for himself in the communist regime in East Germany after his release. Another such activist was my barrack commander, General Major Bamler, who had been a general staff officer in intelligence work in peacetime and during the early part of the war. After Germany occupied Norway, he became Chief of Staff to the Supreme Military Commander in Norway. Later, he was transferred to the Eastern Front as a division commander, and he was captured there in 1944 when Army Group Centre collapsed. Bamler was in his middle 40s and over 6 feet tall. He was always looking out for his own welfare. He not only did everything the Russians asked him to do, but he did anything he thought they might want. He was not just interested in getting home, but like Naroki was ambitious to play a leading role in the new government of East Germany. He became one of the most active, cunning, unscrupulous and dangerous leaders and organisers in the service of the NKVD. He signed everything the NKVD personnel asked him to sign and wrote inflammatory articles for them, and he tried with all means at his disposal to force others to do the same. He collaborated with the Russians in gathering or fabricating the evidence used to convict many of the people who were later convicted by the Russians and sentenced to long prison terms. If he is still alive, he has the fate of many men on his conscience. We all knew, of course, that he had not had a sudden conversion to communism, but that he had something on his conscience and was just trying to save his own hide at the expense of everyone else, if need be. And of course the Russians knew that too. It may be that as Chief of Staff to the Supreme Military Commander in Norway, he had ordered the execution of partisans or people who supported the partisans. This constituted a very real and serious war crime to the Russians. He knew, of course, that the Russians were aware of what had happened in Norway and that he was at least partially responsible. Norway was long, narrow, mountainous, and difficult to control. If partisans blew up a hydroelectric dam in his area, he would have had to respond to it. As a soldier, it would have been his job to keep the area operating smoothly. The Russians probably were not concerned because they considered Norway to be a Cold War enemy. If he had done the same things in an Eastern European country under their domination, I am certain they would have had him executed. Therefore, he was afraid that the Russians would return him to Norway to stand trial. He probably thought that collaborating with the Russians might save his life. Bamler, in exchange for better food and other privileges, sacrificed all conviction, dignity, and self-respect. Although he pretended to be a converted communist, I am sure that the Russians did not believe that any more than we did. We also had a major in the General Staff who was an activist. He was a very good bridge player, and he and I often teamed up as partners because the two of us could beat almost any other team. He had been the operations officer of an infantry division and had been captured at Stalingrad in 1943. He had become embittered by Hitler's refusal to allow them to fall back and regroup at Stalingrad, and he had turned on the government just as General Feldmarschall von Paulus had. He felt strongly that he was a man without a country and that he owed no allegiance to anyone, and he felt neither guilt nor shame for cooperating with the Russians in exchange for a job in the kitchen and better treatment. Although as far as we knew he had never harmed any of us, we were very careful around him and avoided providing him with any information that could be used against us. He was not a gloomy or depressing person, in spite of his dark conclusions about his fate. In fact, he was almost cheerful much of the time. He was sometimes called in for interrogation at night, and that usually meant that the person being interrogated was actually reporting to the Russians. Another activist was a young officer named Count von Waldersee, who was in the camp because he came from a well-known noble family. His grandfather had been a Prussian General Feldmarschall and Chief of the General Staff. The grandson was in his early 20s, tall and blonde. In spite of his noble background, he was easily bluffed and cowed. He was especially afraid the Russians would never let him go home because of his grandfather, so he cooperated with them to convince them he was on their side. A separate anti-fascist group of activists was established by the Russians for every national group. Each anti-fascist active adapted the orders of the NKVD's political department to its own national mentality and then carried them out. Each national group of activists was controlled by a leader and several close associates. An extended active, to which all activists belonged, exercised control over the national groups. Through this group, the Russians came to know everything that was going on in the camp in the shortest possible time. The activists considered it their anti-fascist duty to watch everybody and everything going on in the camp and report everything immediately to their Russian superiors. A few of the activists refused to collaborate to that extent, a very dangerous thing for them to do because, to the Russians, that was supporting the reactionary forces in the camp, a very serious offence. On the other hand, some of the activists could not seem to do enough to get in good with the Russians. The Russians also sometimes used different national groups against each other. One of the national groups of activists was the Austrians, who conveniently forgot that Austria had voted 90% in favour of being incorporated into the Reich in 1938. Encouraging the Austrians to pretend they had been enslaved, and that they hated the Germans gave the Russians a large pool of people they could use to help keep us under control. The Austrians wore little red flags on their sleeves to distinguish them from the rest of us. Control of the Krasnogorsk prison camp was in the hands of the NKVD's operations department, although its people always remained very much in the background. Reporting to the operations department of the NKVD was the political department, to which our interrogators belonged. This department controlled the political and intelligence activities in the camp by issuing directives to the inmate activists. It also controlled access to the newspapers Pravda and Izvestia, the radio news broadcasts, the propaganda films we were shown 4 or 5 times a year about the inevitability of communism, and any cultural activities like concerts and plays. Everything the Russians did was directed toward one great goal: to strengthen their own forces for the coming battle with capitalism, meaning the non-Soviet dominated part of the world, and to weaken their adversaries in any way possible. The sheer volume of the constant propaganda the Russians heaped on us had a depressing effect on us. Their political slogans were posted everywhere in the camp. It was impossible to open our eyes without seeing them on the walls no matter where we were. In the barracks, in the laundry, in the bathhouse, in the latrine, in the administration building, everywhere. Their theory was that if something was repeated over and over and over, it would eventually become an unquestioned fact in one's mind. That is how they maneuvered people to the point where for them the Soviet Union is for peace and the United States is for war was not an opinion, but an unquestionable fact. The constant theme throughout all their propaganda was how peace-loving the Soviet Union was and how warmongering the United States was. To my chagrin, this heavy-handed brainwashing seemed to work. They actually got people to the point where to question something like that seemed wildly illogical. They also showed us outrageously distorted political films to try to influence our thinking. The Russians at one time brought in professors from Moscow University to give us lectures in their versions of history and political philosophy. They gave it up after a few months, however, because we asked questions instead of just accepting what they told us. If you applied a Western mind to their doctrines, the doctrines did not stand up under questioning. It was like religion. You had to accept their doctrine on faith or not at all. No doubt existed in their minds that everything Marx and Lenin said was unquestionable truth. It was impossible in their minds for either man to have been wrong. We found that they were so incredibly set in their thinking that they could not even comprehend that other people could think differently. When we pointed out fallacies in their logic, they could not cope with it. They felt ridiculed by our questions and our insisting on logic. We had professors of their own rank among us who posed questions they could not even comprehend because of the mental straitjacket in which they had bound their minds. So they discontinued their series of political lectures, although they had apparently found such lectures successful with German communists. All the people who formed the first East German government had been given this kind of education in the same camp we were in before it had been converted to a prison camp. The difference was that the German communists blindly accepted their theories on faith, and we did not. The Russians' main objective seemed to be to produce spies who would work for them after returning home. They were looking to the future. They wanted people they could blackmail, who would return to West Germany or other Western countries and appear to be beyond suspicion, and could therefore get into important positions. The more important the victim's former position, the greater his intellectual powers, and the more unsuspected his political conduct during captivity, the more valuable they felt he was to them. But the victim first had to be made to cooperate. They tried especially to recruit people who had never been sympathetic to the communist cause, because they would be less suspect back in their home communities. We were able to gain some insight into the recruitment methods used by the Russian intelligence service from our own experiences during interrogations, from conversations with other prisoners, and from direct observation of people and events. The clandestine informers, as opposed to the known activists, were coerced to play another role in addition to spying for the Russians. to select from among their fellow prisoners those who might be suitable for future deployment as Russian agents once they had been returned home. In this role, they tried to find out about a potential victim's family and financial circumstances, as well as his ideological attitudes, all this in order to draw conclusions about whether he could be coerced to work later as an agent for the Soviet Union. The final decision about such a person was made by the Russians, of course, but all the preparatory work was done by German informers. Only very clever informers who had a profound knowledge of human nature and the trust of the Russians were suitable for such work. With the help of the activists and the other informers, the Russians had no difficulty getting sworn, but false written testimony against any prisoner, based on which the prisoner could be convicted for war crimes, not only in Russian courts, but even in the courts of the prisoner's own country. After they had selected a victim by close scrutiny of his qualifications, the Russians put him under steadily increasing pressure until he thought the only way he could go on living was to sign the document they wanted him to sign. The document always incriminated some innocent fellow prisoner of a false war crime, but exonerated the victim himself. Of course, the victim knew that others had signed similar documents incriminating him. If necessary, the Russians would show him the documents that incriminated him falsely. Once this had been accomplished, the victim was asked whether he would be willing to perform certain tasks for them upon returning home. If he refused to cooperate now, he would disappear into the Russian penal camps, from which he would not return. If he refused to cooperate after he had returned home, the Russians would produce the signed documents that would convict him in the courts of law in his own country. The Russians found it easy to put us under pressure. We had invaded Russia, and they constantly preached to us that we were war criminals. It never stopped. We did not invite you here. You invaded Russia. You are all war criminals. And it was true that we had invaded Russia. We could not deny it. We were not responsible for our government's decision to invade, but we certainly could not deny that Germany had started the war against Russia and that we had been our government's instrument of war. We knew they could do whatever they wanted to us. We were completely at their mercy. Their murder of over 4,000 Polish officers at Katyn was a chilling reminder of what they were capable of, and our feeling of utter helplessness was overpowering. I had already been subjected to it in the 2 prison camps in Germany, but it was more difficult to endure here because we were so far from home and everything was so foreign to us. In combat we had been strengthened by a sense of duty and military unity, but in this new situation nothing was clear. There were no rules, and everything had to be learned by trial and error. They tried to put an enormous burden of guilt on each of us, drilling into us the guilt of every individual German and the right of the Soviet Union to protect itself by any means against a repetition of German aggression and arrogance. Of course, Russia had actually done to Poland, Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania what Germany had only attempted to do to Russia, but we tactfully did not point this out to them. We were constantly reminded that it was only due to the unprecedented generosity of the Soviet government that we were allowed to live at all. The Russians preferred people without strong political convictions. Although such people would never be avid Marxists, neither would they be fanatical in their opposition to Soviet policies and objectives, so they would not risk everything in order to harm the Soviet Union. To pressure people to agree to cooperate with them, the Russians employed various tactics. These included keeping individuals in solitary confinement for extended periods, sometimes in complete darkness, withholding food for long stretches, and conducting relentless interrogations that lasted for days without rest or sleep, with shifts of interrogators working around the clock. One such individual subjected to such treatment was Oberst Heigl, who had served in intelligence in the Luftwaffe. His father's background in the German military mission in Madrid and his fluency in Spanish made him a target for Russian recruitment as a spy. Despite his naturally cheerful disposition, Heigl found himself despondent due to the incessant interrogations and pressure exerted on him. Solitary confinement and deprivation left him pale, disoriented, and subdued. His fellow prisoners understood the psychological torment he endured and the internal struggle he faced. Hunger, desperation, fear, and hopelessness proved effective in breaking many prisoners. The effects of hunger varied among individuals. Some became fixated on food, ultimately surrendering their pride. The prison environment revealed unexpected behaviors in individuals, irrespective of their past war records. Even decorated war heroes succumbed to the psychological stress of captivity. Luftwaffe fighter pilot Oberstleutnant Graf, renowned for downing nearly 400 enemy aircraft, found himself unable to endure prison life and complied with Russian demands out of fear of reprisal. While he rationalized his actions, his cooperation eroded both his self-respect and the respect of his peers. Graf's involvement in propagandist activities, such as lending his name to articles praising the Russian Air Force, tarnished his reputation further. Despite his intelligence, Graf's actions damaged his own esteem and that of his fellow prisoners. His compliance bolstered Russian propaganda efforts and boosted the confidence of their fighter pilots, though it did not alter the stark reality of the Western forces' superiority. Graf's decision to collaborate stemmed from fear rather than coercion, contradicting the belief that collaboration was necessary for survival. In contrast to those who capitulated, some prisoners, like the Speaker, maintained their refusal to collaborate with the Russians, despite facing hardships and receiving no privileges in return. I admitted freely that Hitler had been a disaster for Germany, although that had not become apparent to me until late in the war. But I also told them that with my education and cultural background, I could not accept their system either, and they seemed to respect that. The Germans who became turncoats did not get anywhere with the Russians. In fact, the Russians just assumed that they had something to hide and started bearing down to find out what it was. For example, an Oberst in our camp had been in Yugoslavia during the war and had been part of an action there in which partisans had been killed. He became an activist and an ardent supporter of the Russians to try to protect himself, but that just made them suspicious, and they turned the pressure on and learned of his background in Yugoslavia. He had been a regiment commander whose regiment had wiped out villages for supporting the partisans. About 40 years old, he was a serious and conscientious man, and he felt he had done only what had to be done if order was to be maintained in Yugoslavia. He had a wife and 4 children at home, and he wanted desperately to return to them. He disappeared one day, and a few weeks later we heard in the daily news broadcast that he had been convicted of war crimes in Yugoslavia and executed. The best way to avoid this dangerous game was to convince the Russians during their screening sessions that you were unsuitable for their purposes because of your political views, your philosophical views, or your general attitude. Of course, it was not easy to do that without at the same time appearing to be an enemy of the Soviet Union, for which they would punish anyone severely. I managed to do it simply by sticking honestly and openly to my beliefs, but being careful not to attack theirs. It was possible, by careful observation, to identify many of the future agents who had been recruited by the Russians. They got good jobs or other little privileges without any assistance from the activists and sometimes even over the opposition of the activists. It was also obvious that they were at the administration building from time to time when no wave of interrogations was happening. But the most telling sign was a certain insecurity and constraint in their dealings with other prisoners that was especially perceptible to one who had known them for some time. To those who knew them well, there was just something different about them. Though the Russians camouflaged everything connected with these matters in a very sophisticated way, we knew. Because of the many informers, we had to be careful what we said to anyone who was not a very close friend. If we said something against the Soviet system and it was reported, we would be called in for interrogation, and at the very least it would be unpleasant. Of course, it was foolish to knock the Russian system when we were at their complete mercy, but some people did it. To me, those people were foolish rather than brave. If the Russians thought someone's attitude was a serious problem, or even potentially serious, they would threaten the person or move him to a labor camp. They were especially likely to move a person to a labor camp if they thought he was someone who could influence the mood of others in Krasnogorsk. They would not tolerate active opposition to their system. Even if someone just complained about the food or not being able to write letters, and someone reported it, the Russians would summon that person for interrogation and threaten him. The Russians themselves never tried to convert me to communism, although General Major Bamler did. He knew that I had no respect for him and that I was opposed to what he was doing, but he tried anyway. He called me into his little room and started talking about the general staff and trying to convince me that it would be better to give up any opposition because that was all over, and now Germany had to work with the Russians in order to continue to exist as Germany. He said, "You must see that you will not get anywhere if you are hostile. Our time is over, and if you want to get home, you had better cooperate. Of course, there are some things we do not like, just as there were things we did not like in Germany, and so on." From time to time, Russian officials came to the camp from Moscow to get a personal impression and examine the selections that had been made. During the inspections by these officials, massive interrogations would be staged to hide the identities of those few recruited prisoners they actually wanted to interview. Most of these interrogations were about trivial matters. I tried to put my broken world into perspective and understand this new world about me. I systematically studied the literature the Russians made available to us. I listened to their lectures, I talked to German communists, I studied the books in our library by Marx, Lenin and Stalin. I read other literature as well, but I could not convince myself that Bolshevik socialism was anything more than a clever scheme to keep a small group of elitists in power. I felt that if Germany accepted their political system, we would be exchanging a bad system for a worse one. I had philosophical discussions with other prisoners who were supposed to be experts in political philosophy, some of them among the elite of German intellectuals, about communism and other political philosophies, but they were usually disappointing. Most of these people seemed broken by the experience of the last several years and conditions in captivity. Some had just become apathetic. Others became dreamers, thinking only in unrealistic terms and losing all measure of reason. All of us were affected by our total isolation and lack of outside stimulus. Only a minority managed to sort through the communist influence and maintain sound judgment. Trustworthy companionship was my salvation against the Russians' constant attempts to take over my mind. The maintenance of a strong mental attitude was critically important to us. I had close friends with whom I could talk and even discuss dangerous things, intelligent people who shared my social, cultural and educational background. When one of us tended to become negative or defeatist, the rest of us would sense it and move to help that person overcome his mood. Also very important to maintaining a healthy and independent mind was having access to the other intelligent and stimulating people who populated the camp. The value of being with such people was worth more than a larger food ration. During the winter of 1946 to 1947, the Russians made a movie about the Battle for Moscow that took place in December 1941, and they forced all of us who were in uniform to play the role of the German army in that movie. Having been part of the real battle, I was not a willing participant in their movie, but of course I had no choice. They set up propeller-driven airplanes to whip the snow into our faces and create the effect of a winter gale. Of course, the sorry state of our uniforms made us a rather pathetic-looking army, but that probably fit neatly into their propaganda objectives. One day in early 1947, Refior arrived at Krasnogorsk from Butyrka prison. He was a tall man, and he had been quite fat, but of course he was now as skinny as the rest of us. He told me that Weidling and von Dufing were still in Butyrka. We did not talk much. We had never had any particular liking for each other, and now he quickly showed signs of becoming an activist, so I avoided him. I remembered his love of ham and asparagus tips, along with strong coffee and liquor. I had no doubt he would become an activist. The camp had a small library of books we could read, and at one point during 1947 it was expanded by a big shipment of books that had been taken from a city library in East Germany. Several big boxes appeared at the camp, and the activists began to behave secretively. We learned that the boxes contained books. Of course, the Russians had to sort out any books that did not support their system, so the activists went through them and removed all of the books they thought we should not read. The activists were not all terribly intelligent, however, so they let some books slip past them. Of course, they probably also eliminated some books that would not have opposed the Russians' theories. But we still had plenty of books to read, mostly German literary classics, and some of the philosophers on whose work Marx and Engels had built. I spent a lot of my time reading. I felt that it was important to keep my mind as active and alert as possible. Those who did not do so became lethargic, and in time seemed to just vegetate. They would sit with their heads in their hands and stare straight ahead. We learned to let them stare and pay them no heed. We called it dozing. I read French, English, Spanish, or Italian books whenever possible to improve my language skills. I tried to get a good understanding of the Russians' social and economic philosophies. Their philosophical theory of dialectical materialism did not sound very logical to me. In June 1947, the Russians decided to move most of us in the Krasnogorsk prison camp to another camp. We had been kept close to Moscow, so we would be near the political prisons where more important German prisoners were kept. When they had everything they thought they could get from us, we were sent to another camp to make room at Krasnogorsk for new people who were now of greater interest to them. Of course, they could easily call any of us back at any time if they felt they needed us. On the night before we were to leave, our names were called and we were told to be ready to leave the next morning, although we were not told where we were going or why. They searched us before we left the camp, which had never happened during our 2 years at Krasnogorsk. It was not a matter of guards taking watches and rings and anything of value, although there were a few instances of a guard seeing something he liked and taking it, saying, "Not allowed." They were looking for written material. The Russians were always terrified of the power of the written word. They feared our minds. Russian soldiers marched us to railroad tracks, where we waited for a train to arrive. A freight train finally arrived, and we were loaded aboard it. The boxcars did not have windows, but they had ventilation slits near the roof that let in a little light. Straw had been spread on the floor for us to sit and lie down on, and a toilet, a bucket under a board with a hole in it, was in the middle of each car. Probably 500 of us boarded the train, with perhaps 40 in a car. The Russian boxcars were bigger than they were in Western European countries because they had wider tracks. We were on the train for 2 days, stopping at villages for food and water. We disembarked at a railroad station in the region of Tambov, approximately halfway between Moscow and Stalingrad. We then marched an hour and a half from the railroad station to the new camp, which was called Morshansk. There we were searched again and assigned to barracks. Morshansk, which was in a large forest, was larger than the Krasnogorsk camp, but it was also more primitive. All the buildings, for example, were made of logs. The character of the camp was the same as that of Krasnogorsk. It was not a labour camp, but a political camp that specialised in psychological pressure. The barracks were not quite as crowded because it was a larger camp and there was a little more space in which to walk and jog. In addition to the 500 or so of us, Morshansk hid several thousand Japanese soldiers, about 100 Polish prisoners, and perhaps 100 German women prisoners, in a separate part of the camp. We continued on our slow journey to starvation with the same fare we had received at Krasnogorsk, and of course the same German activists who had ruled us at Krasnogorsk continued to do so at Morshansk. As far as our daily routine was concerned, Morshansk was identical to Krasnogorsk. Our lives were impoverished not only by our loss of freedom, but also by the monotony of our routine. The passage of time, in effect, stopped for us as we watched the days, the weeks, the months, and the years slip away meaninglessly. In the outside world, a normal human being would be going through changes that would constitute progress in his life. In the camp, we had to make an effort to keep from stagnating, although compared to the labour camps, our stagnation was probably luxurious. When a person follows the same daily routine starting in the morning, and almost before I realized it, I would find myself in the afternoon. Then twilight would fill the land with shadows, and the morning would have suddenly turned to evening. At times I wondered whether I had spent the day in a trance, and at those times I sometimes questioned my own sanity. Then I would force myself to concentrate more on engaging in activities, chess, bridge, lectures, crafts. Although a day was 24 hours, it equalled nothing. A month was no time at all in our lives. The end of one year and the beginning of the next were as alike to us as any other 2 days selected at random. Thus did the years pass. We did not keep a conscious count of time, as does the person who values it. Our lives were so regimented and routine that at times I wondered whether any of us would ever again be able to function in a society that required us to be responsible for ourselves. We lived a hermetic existence within a timeless vacuum. Yet I found it a learning experience. I feel that I gained an understanding of life that I would not have acquired under normal circumstances, especially the value of patience. At the end of 1947, the Russians sent some of the older prisoners home, and Count Schwerin was among them. I was very happy for him. He planned to go to Bremen, and he offered to help me get a start there if I was ever released and could get to West Germany. We stayed at Moshansk until the middle of 1948, and then we were moved again, this time to Mikhailovka, about 400 kilometers northeast of Moscow. As always, we were not told why we were being sent there. It was near Gorky, on the Volga River. Physical living conditions were better here than they had been at Moshansk, but the psychological pressure got worse. For example, we were denied our semi-annual postcards the first year we were there. Mikhailovka held about 1,000 prisoners, and here there were no civilians or enlisted men, only German officers. Mikhailovka was neither as spacious as Moshansk nor as crowded as Krasnogorsk. Although our interrogations continued at Mikhailovka, nothing out of the ordinary occurred at first. I was not forced to work in any of the camps, but at Mikhailovka the Russians asked sometimes whether anybody wanted to go to a little island in the Volga River to cut reeds for baskets. Some of those who had gone came back and said it was interesting, that it was not much work, and that you could swim in the Volga. So some friends and I volunteered. We had to march perhaps an hour with a few guards to get there. It was almost like an excursion from school. The guards were friendly, and when we arrived we had to cut only as many reeds as we could carry back, and then we were free to swim. It was something different, and it was the only time I did that. At one time during the year and a half that we spent at Mikhailovka, about 40 senior officers were taken to a much smaller camp at Ivanovo, not too far away. I was among the selected group. We went by train, as usual, but because 40 of us were not enough for a special train, we went by commercial train. When we had to change trains, we had to wait about 2 hours for the second train to arrive. We were accompanied by a Russian captain and a non-commissioned officer. The captain left us at the station with the non-com and disappeared into the village. On the other side of the tracks was another platform with about 40 Russian civilian prisoners, men, women and children. They had at least 12 guards with submachine guns, and they were not allowed to move at all. And here we were, all young men, with only one guard. Of course, there was no place for us to go, many hundreds of kilometers from any other country, and with the language barrier, escape would have been impossible. But it was terrible to see the way they treated their own people. They were surely political prisoners, since so many were women and children. Then we arrived at the camp near Ivanovo and learned that we were there to work. Most of us refused because of the Stalin order, which we quoted to them. They thought we would prefer to work because the camp was just one barrack with a fence around it, and we had nothing whatever to do if we did not work. But most of us refused on principle. The Russians did not harass us. Those who wanted to work did, and the rest of us did not. If they had asked at Mikhailovka, they could have taken only those who wanted to work, but they did not operate that way. It was apparently just a temporary thing they wanted done, and we were there for less than 2 months. Beginning in early 1949, we were finally allowed to receive letters. We could not write them, but we could receive them. Since Lilo was in East Germany, she knew she could write to me because the Russians publicized how generous they were being. For a while, she could write to me once a month, but I never received all of her letters because the Russians used them as a weapon against us. If someone did something the Russians did not like, they would tell him when a letter arrived from his wife, but they would not give it to him. They also used this as a form of coercion to get people to cooperate with them, and they used the letters, including those they never gave us, to gather information about what people were thinking in Germany. They also censored our mail, deleting anything negative about them or their system. If Lilo wrote anything about hunger in East Germany, for example, they would either cut it out or not give me the letter. After we had been at Mikhailovka about a year, a rumour circulated through the camp that a military commission was coming from Moscow to put some of us on trial for war crimes. The rumour was true. The camp commander was very nervous about the arrival of the commission because the arrival of such a commission from Moscow was always important. Everything had to be cleaned, like a military installation before an inspection. The trials began during the summer of 1949. The Russians, of course, were not humane enough to post the names of those who would be tried, so each of us would know from the outset whether he was on the list. Instead, they called only a small group at a time, and the people in the group went in one at a time. This went on for weeks, with everyone under the stress of not knowing whether he would be in the next group. Fortunately, I was not called for trial. Of the 1,000 prisoners at Mikhailovka, about half were called for trial, mostly senior officers. Everyone had been interrogated at least twice a year since 1945, and the Russians had kept transcripts of all the interviews. They had always been especially interested in our military experiences in Russia during the war. They compared the transcripts of our different interrogations, and if there were any discrepancies, they wanted to know why. They did not consider that memories could grow dim or that differences between the Russian and German languages could cause translation problems. The people they called were all convicted of war crimes and sentenced to 5, 10, 15, 20 or 25 years in a labour camp. A crime was eating a Russian chicken during the war or feeding your horse Russian grain or hay. That was considered stealing socialist property, and for that people were sentenced to a minimum of 5 years in a labour camp. Of course, Mikhailovka held no real war criminals. People who had executed partisans or committed similar crimes had been sorted out and dealt with back at Krasnogorsk long ago. As I began my 5th year in Russian captivity, I finally decided that I would never return home. Those who had been convicted were being sent to labour camps, and I concluded that the rest of us would spend our remaining lives in the prison camps. I, therefore, decided to learn the Russian language properly. Most of us knew some of the language, the daily things you had to know just to survive. If you were going to another camp, for example, you had to be able to understand what the Russian soldiers wanted you to do, so you did not get shot for not following orders. Now I decided to learn the Russian language systematically, grammar and all. We had ethnic Germans from Estonia and other Baltic areas, and many of them spoke Russian as their first language. I began to study Russian with them in earnest. Having finally accepted the conclusion that I would never return home, my thoughts automatically turned to my 2 sons. It occurred to me now that without a father to guide them, they could be brainwashed into growing up as communists. That would be the final irony. We had told ourselves that one of the reasons we invaded Russia in 1941 was to free the Russian people from communist oppression. How many of the children of the German soldiers who took part in that invasion would now be raised under communist rule? And how many of them would be communists? I knew very well how insidious and overwhelming ceaseless propaganda can be. If I were home, I would be unable to do anything about the Russian occupation of East Germany, but I would be able to give my sons a balanced perspective against which to evaluate communism. At the beginning of December 1949, we began to get rumours that those of us who had not been convicted and sent to labour camps were going to be sent home. I did not put any faith in such rumours, because we had been promised so many times before that we would be home by Christmas that it would be foolish to believe such a rumour now. Then, about mid-December, the Russians read a list of those who were to go home. We still refused to believe it, because we had been lied to so many times before, and this was exactly the sort of psychological game the Russians loved to play. We could not help hoping, of course, but we were afraid to believe. Then we were inspected, however, and those whose clothes were too shabby even for the Russians got something better. My clothes were still okay. I had my boots and riding pants, and I still had my fur-lined overcoat, so I did not need clothing. Of course, we all had the caps with ear flaps that the Russians had provided. Even though we were afraid to do so, we slowly began to believe that we were really going home. Finally, the day came when they told us to be ready to leave the next morning. We fell out the next morning and were searched. A guard took a chess set I had made, because I had 2 of them, and he said I could use only 1. They marched us through the camp gate, and the small number of guards seemed a good indication that we were not going to another camp. I do not remember how far it was to the railroad station, but we marched to the train. They loaded us into boxcars again, just as they always had when we moved from one camp to another. The guards were friendly this time, however, which was another good sign, and in the boxcars there were boards for us to lie and sit on instead of just straw on the floor. Since it was winter, we also had a stove in the centre of each boxcar. And then the final proof that we really were going home, they did not lock the boxcar doors. We could not keep ourselves from starting to get excited now. Even though it was bitter cold, we left the door open a crack, for fear that it might be locked again if we closed it. This trip was more comfortable than any other trip we had ever made as prisoners, and we were excited and in a great mood. We talked about the coming Christmas and what we planned to do, and we talked about our families. We sang our old army songs, songs about girls, and Christmas songs. The trip took several days, and we stopped in villages for food and water as usual. Sometimes when the train stopped, the Russians came aboard and called out some names of people who were then taken off the train and returned to prison. They did not do it at every stop, and it was not many people, but it planted terror in everyone's heart. The Russians seemed to be pathologically addicted to psychologically tormenting us. I tried to visualize Lilo, Klaus, and Alexander, but I found it difficult. They were just the photographs in my locket, and I could not visualize them as flesh and blood people. Klaus would not remember me, of course, and Alexander had never seen me. Reaching home would be like being born again. I planned to stop only briefly in East Germany, and then go on to West Germany if I could possibly find a way to do it. We knew about the division of Germany, and I did not want to live in the Russian-occupied zone. I had seen all of communism that I wanted to see. When we arrived at the border between Poland and East Germany, we got our release papers. At the same time our train arrived there, another train arrived from somewhere else with women prisoners. That was the first contact we'd had with women, except for the Russian doctors in the prison camps. The women had been working in mines, even though the Russians had promised in Berlin when we surrendered that all the women would be allowed to go home. We had used thousands of civilian female telephone operators in the Signal Corps, and the Russians had taken them to Siberia to work in the mines. They had spent the same number of years in much worse camps than we had been in. Although they were young women, they no longer looked it. They had not had enough food, and they had been worked hard, and none of them looked young or pretty, even to men who had not seen women in nearly 5 years. East German soldiers had to process us in a big room at the railroad station in which old desks had been set up for that purpose. They were unfriendly, almost surly. We stood in line before one of the desks, and when it was my turn, the soldier at the desk asked, "Where are you from?" I told him I was from Bremen, West Germany. I had made up my mind to get to West Germany, beyond the reach of the Russians, even at the cost of getting Lilo and the children out after I was free. The people processing us had no papers on any of us, so they just had to accept whatever we told them. When he asked for an address in Bremen, I gave him the address of Judge Powerleck from our group. Then he wrote me a railroad ticket to Bremen. He also gave me discharge pay of 300 Deutsche Marks, my release papers, written in Russian, German and English, which said that I had been released from Russian captivity and the railroad ticket home. Then we got some food and got on another train. It was a special train for prisoners returning home, but it had passenger cars instead of boxcars, an unbelievable luxury for us. We were all wearing parts of our German uniforms, supplemented by Russian clothing, such as quilted jackets. And, of course, we all had those Russian caps with the ear flaps. I was wearing the same uniform, boots, riding breeches, blouse, I had worn into captivity except for my cap. In addition to the chess set I had made, I also had a cigarette case carved from juniper wood, the fold-out picture frame a friend had made and given me for Christmas one year, and a little box made of aluminum that someone had made, and I had won in a chess tournament. It was engraved, Chess Master of Krasnogorsk. The East German soldiers were overworked because 2 trains of prisoners had arrived at the same time, and they had a huge job just to process us. We were the first group of senior officers and the first general staff officers the Russians had released. Being back in Germany gave us no sense of relief yet, because it was still the Russian-occupied sector of Germany. We could still have been pulled off the train and sent back to prison. The prisoner train I was taking to Helmstedt, at the border between East and West Germany, stopped at Leipzig, because it was a rail centre. Entering the suburbs of Leipzig was like flashing back to my childhood. Always, when I had returned from summer vacations as a child, the most exciting thing about getting back home was the familiar experience of seeing the first Leipzig streetcar. The streetcars of different German cities were different colours and shapes, so a city could be identified by its streetcars. Leipzig's streetcars were still green and beige. When I saw the first one, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I knew I was home, and all those childhood memories came rushing back. Familiar buildings began to appear, and finally the familiar old platform at the railroad station. The station, like much of the city, was still very much damaged from the war. Coming through the suburbs, we saw many destroyed and damaged houses, even now, 4.5 years after the end of the war. Leipzig was a 1-hour food stop for the special prisoner train I was on. I talked to the railroad people and learned that a prisoner train was scheduled through Leipzig to Helmstedt every day for the next several days, and that I could catch it any day. If I tried to use my special train ticket, strictly for prisoners of war, for any other train, it could have been dangerous, but I could use it for another prisoner of war train. Since there were no guards in charge of us or the train, I decided to catch another train on another day, but I planned to go to the station every day to make sure the prisoner trains were continuing. I went to my mother's apartment so I could take a bath and change to decent civilian clothes before going to Lilo's apartment. My mother did not expect me, of course. I had no way to let anyone know I was coming home. I just rang the doorbell. She could not believe it when she saw me. She gasped, and I thought for a moment she would faint. Then her face lit up, and when I stooped to embrace her, she began to sob uncontrollably. Tears rolled down her face as we stood clinging to one another. Finally, we found our voices, and we talked non-stop for an hour, mostly about what life had been like in the prison camp and in Russian-occupied East Germany. I bathed and changed into some of my old civilian clothes that I had left at my mother's house so many years ago. It seemed unreal to see my old clothes, which now hung loosely on me. This whole experience had the quality of a dream rather than reality. My mother fixed a meal of cold cuts and cheese with bread and butter and real tea. Food had never tasted so good in my entire life. There was no full telephone service yet in East Germany. Many such things had not yet been fully restored, so I could not call Lilo. I took about a 20-minute streetcar ride to her apartment. When she heard the doorbell, Lilo thought it was someone from neighborhood control because she had her lights on when it was forbidden. Electricity was rationed. When she opened the door and saw me, her expression was as unbelieving as my mother's had been. I was so excited that I thought my heart would surely stop. I stepped inside the door and we fell into each other's arms. Having her in my embrace was breathtaking, and I felt almost lightheaded. We just clung to each other, both of us racked with sobs. Then I saw Klaus and Alexander standing behind her. I knelt before Klaus and said, "Hello, Klaus," and he caught on to who I was and shyly let me hug him. Lilo knelt by Alexander, who was 4, and said, "It is Daddy." I said, "Hello, Alexander," and he looked at Lilo and said, "He still knows me." Lilo and I looked at each other and began to laugh, but the laughter abruptly turned to tears, and we clung to each other as if we could never part again. Then we sat down and put the children on our laps and became a family again. I was able to stay with Lilo and the children for several days, and it was pure heaven. I learned that when Alexander was born, Lilo had gone to a small private hospital where she knew a doctor before dark each night and returned home the next morning. The Russians had imposed a curfew at dark, and if Alexander had decided to arrive after dark and Lilo had been at home, she would have been unable to go to the hospital. The war had been over only 3 months at that time, and being in the streets after curfew was dangerous, because patrolling Russian soldiers would shoot without warning. Lilo had lived with her mother at first. They lived by selling their jewellery and crystal and clothing to the Russians. But then a Russian official took over her mother's apartment and forced Lilo to move out, although her mother was permitted to stay and keep house for the Russian. Later, the Russians attempted to revive the old Leipzig fashion fair. Leipzig had been a fashion centre before the war, and Lilo got a job modelling clothing there. From then on, she was able to make a living by modelling. Before I arrived home, Lilo had received a visit from an official of the Communist Party who told her that I would return home soon, and that when I arrived, they had a very good job for me in my old profession. That frightened me, because it meant they expected me and would come looking for me. Lilo and I made plans for getting her and the children to West Germany. She could get a pass to visit me, as long as she left the children in Leipzig, so we planned that once I got out she would visit me, and then we would make firm plans to get her and the children out. I wanted to stay with Lilo and the children for several days before going to Bremen. Klaus and Alexander had both been instructed not to tell anyone I was home. On my 3rd day home, however, a long line of people had queued up at a milk store to buy milk, and Klaus called out to the milkman, "My daddy is here, but nobody is supposed to know." A neighbour who heard that came immediately to Lilo and told her. I quickly changed back to my smelly old uniform to catch the next prisoner train. I took a small, shabby-looking suitcase this time, and put in it all the film negatives that I had accumulated from childhood through 1944. When I had been assigned to Schöner's staff in January 1945, I had not taken my camera because I believed I would not survive the war. I was taking a terrible chance because I risked being sent back to the prison camps if the Russians or East Germans searched us and found my negatives. But somehow to leave them would have been to leave my whole life until now in the hands of the communists. I got on the prisoner of war train at the Leipzig railroad station. We pulled out of Leipzig and went to Marienborn-Helmstedt, at the border between East and West Germany. A small river separated East and West Germany, and there was a railroad station on each side of the river. The train stopped at the East German station, at the small town of Marienborn, and we disembarked. We all had our packages or shabby suitcases, and we were all wearing a mixture of our worn-out German uniforms and articles of worn-out Russian uniforms. They called us into formation, brought us to attention, and marched us across the bridge to West Germany, to the city of Helmstedt. The tension mounted in each of us individually, and in all of us as a group as we crossed the bridge, because once across that bridge we knew we were beyond the control of the Russians, and they could no longer pull us out of the column and send us back to a prison camp. When the front of the column cleared the far end of the bridge, the liberated prisoners broke ranks and began to cheer. As the end of the column melted into the cheering throng on the other side, we all spontaneously, almost as if on command, jerked off our Russian caps and, with a deafening cheer, heaved them into the river. From Helmstedt, West Germany, we went by train to a hospital near Bremen for a medical checkup. I was 30 pounds underweight and suffering from severe protein deficiency. Von Berkersrode was also at the hospital, having arrived several days earlier with our original train. We stayed in the hospital 3 weeks while the staff fattened us up. Lilo obtained a passport to visit me at the hospital, and we made plans to get her and the children out of East Germany. Children did not need a passport to travel between East and West Germany, but adults did. Our plan was for her to send Luaus to me, and then I would send her a telegram that Klaus was deathly ill and she should come immediately. The plan, of course, was that she would bring Alexander with her. When I was released from the hospital, I looked up Count Schwerin, who had been released 2 years earlier and had established a business in Bremen. He gave me a job in his business, and when I was established with a job and a place to live, Lilo sent Klaus to me. Since I had only a sleeping room and Klaus had to go to school, I found a family who was willing to board him for me until Lilo and Alexander could join us. Then, as planned, I sent Lilo the telegram that Klaus was deathly ill and she should come immediately. The East German government refused to give her a passport, however, until she produced an affidavit from the physician attending Klaus. I found a physician who was willing to give me such an affidavit, and Lilo got her passport. By now, the East German government was requiring passports for children, however, and they refused to grant one to Alexander. So Lilo had to leave Alexander with my mother when she joined Klaus and me in Bremen. It took us 1 full year to free Alexander from the clutches of the East German government. My mother badgered the passport officials every day their office was open for the entire year until she wore them down. They finally found a loophole that enabled them to get rid of this pesky woman, the fact that I had been born in Brunsbüttel, which was now in West Germany. Finally, we were all permanently together. In April 1951, with financial assistance from the West German government, I entered the University of Rastasil, near Bremen. 1 year later, in April 1952, Sylvia, our first daughter, was born. In September 1952, I went as an exchange student to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. During the year I was at Antioch College, I recruited sponsors for my eventual return to the United States. I was determined to get myself and my family as far from communist rule as possible, both geographically and ideologically. I returned to Bremen in 1953 and received my diploma in April 1954. I returned to the United States late in June 1954 with my family on an immigration visa. After working briefly on a construction crew in Yellow Springs, Ohio, I joined the international division of a large corporation in early 1955. I retired in 1983 at the age of 66. General Weidling died in 1955 in Butyrka prison in Moscow, according to von Duffing. Oberst von Duffing spent 10 years in Russian captivity and was released in 1955. His first 2 years in Russia were spent at Butyrka prison. Then he spent 2 more years in a prison in Orel, from which he was sent to a labour camp at Vorkuta, north of the Arctic Circle, in 1949. On the way to Vorkuta, he met Raoul von Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat imprisoned by the Russians at the end of the war. The Russians had claimed he died in 1947. At Vorkuta, the Russians apparently intended people to die, considering the prisoners' exposure to the weather, the hours of hard work, the quarters, and the inadequate food. It was also dark several months of the year and extremely depressing. Miraculously, von Duffing survived almost 2 years at Vorkuta and then was moved to a camp near Stalingrad, where he received his first mail from home in 1951. He spent the rest of his imprisonment in a camp at Asbest in the Ural Mountains, and was released at the end of 1955 after German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated the release of the remaining German prisoners in exchange for improved West German-Soviet relations. Today, von Dufing lives in a small town near Cologne. Major von Berkersrode lives today in Baden-Baden, West Germany. Major Wolf became godfather to our daughter, Sylvia, but he dropped out of sight, and I have not heard of him in many years. Count Schwerin, now in his 90s, emigrated to Canada and lives today in Montreal.